January 1997. A 27-year-old man sits alone in his mother's house in Virginia. Divorce papers still fresh in his pocket, a sleeping bag on the floor where he's been crashing. Christmas has just passed. In his hands, an acoustic guitar. In his head, a chord progression he'd stumbled on weeks earlier that reminded him of Sonic Youth. For most people, this would be rock bottom. For Dave Grohl, it was the moment Everlong was born. 6 months earlier, he'd walked into Bear Creek Studios in Washington with a full band, ready to prove that Foo Fighters was more than just a solo project from Nirvana's former drummer. 6 months earlier, he had a marriage, a drummer, and a plan. Now, in early 1997, as he secretly re-recorded an entire album in Los Angeles without telling that drummer, 2 marriages were falling apart, band members were quitting, and the future of Foo Fighters hung by a thread. The album that would emerge from this chaos, The Color and the Shape, would sell over 2 million copies, spawn 3 massive hits, and become the band's defining masterpiece. But the cost was almost everything: friendships, marriages, and very nearly the band itself. This is the story of how one of rock's most beloved albums was forged in the fire of divorce, betrayal, and perfectionism. How a therapy session became a Grammy-nominated record. How Dave Grohl's refusal to compromise nearly destroyed the band he'd just created. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Foo Fighters. To understand what The Color and the Shape meant, you have to understand what Dave Grohl was running from in 1996. 3 years earlier, Kurt Cobain had died by suicide. Nirvana, the most important rock band of the 1990s, was gone. And Grohl, the drummer, the guy in the back who'd never sung lead vocals in his life, was suddenly alone with a decision: retire at 25 or start over. He chose to start over, but he did it in secret. In October 1994, Grohl locked himself in a studio with his friend Barrett Jones and recorded an entire album in 5 days. He played every instrument himself: drums, guitar, bass. He wrote songs with nonsensical lyrics like "Minisin is pretty, Minisin is good." Minisin was acne medication. The lyrics didn't matter to him. What mattered was making noise loud enough to drown out the grief. He called the project Foo Fighters, named after World War II pilots' slang for UFOs, and released it as a cassette he gave to friends. He expected maybe 100 people to hear it. Instead, This Is a Call became a radio hit. I'll Stick Around became an anthem. Big Me went into MTV rotation. By mid-1995, Dave Grohl had accidentally created one of the year's biggest rock albums. But here's what nobody knew: there was no band. It was all Dave, alone in a studio, playing every note himself. So he scrambled to build one. He called Pat Smear, the guitarist who'd toured with Nirvana in their final months. He recruited Nate Mendel and William Goldsmith, the rhythm section from the emo band Sunny Day Real Estate, after leaving them a note at one of their final shows. The 4 of them hit the road throughout 1995 and 1996, playing over 125 shows that first year alone. During soundchecks, they'd workshop new songs. During van rides, they'd argue about arrangements. By late 1996, they'd written enough material for a second album. This time, it would be a real band effort. This time, Dave Grohl wouldn't play everything himself. This time, everything would go wrong. Fall 1996. Dave Grohl has a vision for Foo Fighters' second album that terrifies him. He wants to make a slick rock record. The first album was punk rock, raw, fast, recorded in 5 days with minimal production. Critics loved its garage rock energy. But Grohl wanted more. He wanted clarity. He wanted complexity. He wanted unconventional arrangements and guitar overdubs layered like a Pixies record. So he hired the man who'd produced Pixies, Gil Norton. Norton was a Liverpool-born producer known for 2 things: making brilliant albums and being absolutely relentless in the studio. He'd worked with Echo and the Bunnymen, Pixies, Trompe le Monde, and dozens of other alternative rock classics. His reputation preceded him. He was a whipcracker, a perfectionist, someone who wouldn't let you leave until the take was right. He did not like to mess around at all, Grohl would later recall. He wouldn't let me have dinner until I'd written some lyrics. Every time I wrote a bad line, I'd get 40 lashes. Before recording began, Norton insisted on pre-production. Weeks of rehearsal where they'd strip songs back to their basics, rework arrangements, tighten melodies. For a band raised on punk rock's DIY ethos, it felt like boot camp. Then came the lyrics. Grohl had written the first album's lyrics in deliberately vague, nonsensical terms. He didn't want anyone understanding what he was feeling. Norton wasn't having it. Last time the lyrics were obscure for a good reason, Grohl admitted to Melody Maker. They were nonsense. I just needed a vocal track. But Gil wouldn't let that happen this time. The problem was, by late 1996, Grohl actually had something real to write about. His marriage was falling apart. He'd married Jennifer Youngblood, a photographer, in 1994, right after Nirvana ended, right as Foo Fighters was taking off. She was young, he was young, they were in love. But Grohl was about to admit something in interviews years later. He'd been unfaithful. By winter 1996, the marriage was over, and Gil Norton was demanding Grohl write honest, meaningful lyrics about it. Grohl described what resulted as "the winter of my discontent," an album that tracked the emotional journey of divorce, from chaos to acceptance, from anger to peace, songs that oscillated between ballads and explosive rockers to mirror his swinging emotions. "When we sequenced the album," Grohl said, "I realized it runs like a therapy session. The first song, Doll, is about fear of entering something you're not prepared for. Then we build through the anger, the pain, and by the last track, I'm okay. I can make my way through this." He joked about putting a therapist's couch on the album cover. For the rest of his life, listening to this album would transport him back to fall 1996, his personal journal entries set to music. November 18, 1996, Foo Fighters arrive at Bear Creek Studios in Woodinville, Washington. The setting should be perfect, a residential recording facility located in a converted barn on a 10-acre farm with a salmon stream running through it. The band stays in a cabin adjacent to the studio. It's picturesque, it's peaceful, it's isolated, it's a disaster. Bassist Nate Mendel would later admit, "I was fucking terrible." Drummer William Goldsmith's take was blunt. "Gil called Nate and I the rhythmless section, so that was encouraging." The problem was simple. Gil Norton was demanding perfection from musicians who'd learned to play in punk clubs where energy mattered more than precision. Norton wanted them to nail their parts, take after take after take. He wanted every note tight, every rhythm locked in, every performance polished. For William Goldsmith, it was torture. "Dave had me do 96 takes of one song," Goldsmith told the Miami New Times in 1998. "I had to do 13 hours worth of takes on another one." Grohl, watching from the control room, was unhappy. The drum parts weren't matching what he'd heard in his head when he wrote the songs. But Goldsmith was Foo Fighters' drummer, a founding member who'd been there since 1994. How do you tell your bandmate that their drumming isn't good enough? Answer: you don't. You just keep recording, hoping it gets better. It didn't get better. Grohl later reflected, "The only other producers I'd worked with were Butch Vig and Steve Albini. With the color and the shape, we got Gil Norton to produce the record, and he really whipped us into shape. Tracking with Gil was like a lesson in your craft. It was nuts. He wanted it tight. He wanted it to be perfect. It was intense." The band was also expensive, really expensive. They were burning through studio budget on a residential facility, recording tracks they weren't satisfied with, under intense pressure to deliver a hit follow-up album. "It was an expensive place," Grohl recalled to Kerrang. "We were really under the gun. There was a lot of pressure to produce and have the album out soon. It was just a bad experience. Maybe we went in too soon." By early December, they'd recorded versions of Doll, Up in Arms, My Poor Brain, and several others. Most would eventually be scrapped. On top of the studio tension, Grohl's personal life was imploding. A couple weeks before Christmas, a legal courier showed up at the studio. Divorce papers. His marriage to Jennifer Youngblood was officially over. Producer Gil Norton remembers, "Dave didn't get overly emotional about it with me, and I didn't see him crying or anything, but obviously it was a big part of his life and a concern at the time." The band broke for the holidays. Grohl went back to Virginia to lick his wounds at his mother's house, sleeping on the floor in a sleeping bag. He took the Bear Creek recordings with him, listening, trying to figure out why they weren't working. That's when something unexpected happened. Christmas 1996. Dave Grohl is alone in Virginia, going through the wreckage of his life. His marriage is over, his album isn't working, his drummer is struggling, his bassist is struggling, the budget is blown, Capitol Records is waiting for a hit, and somewhere in the back of his mind, there's this guitar riff he'd stumbled on weeks earlier during downtime at Bear Creek Studios. The band had been recording Monkey Wrench, which uses drop D tuning, and during a break, Grohl was messing around with his guitar in the same tuning. He hit a chord progression that made him stop. It sounded like Sonic Youth. Specifically, it reminded him of their song Schizophrenia. "I thought it was a great Sonic Youth ripoff," Grohl later joked. The band had jammed on it a few times, but the song remained unformed. Just a riff, nothing more, until Christmas. Staying at a friend's house in Virginia, Grohl picked up an acoustic guitar. That chord progression came back. But this time, something was different. He was in a different emotional place. Broken open by divorce, raw from the failed recording sessions, vulnerable in a way he'd never been before. "I was breaking up with a girl I had been with for a while," Grohl explained years later. So I was sort of in the middle of this intense emotional period. For whatever reason, the emotion or the feeling I got when I would play this succession of chords sort of touched on whatever that emotion was. He started writing lyrics. Real lyrics. Not nonsense about acne medication, but actual feelings about actual love. The song was about a woman he'd fallen for, Louise Post from the band Veruca Salt. And the intensity of that connection. It was about being connected to someone so much, Grohl said, that not only do you love them physically and spiritually, but when you sing along with them, you harmonize perfectly. In 45 minutes, Everlong came together on that acoustic guitar. Grohl knew instantly it was special. He needed to record it before he forgot it. He called a friend in Washington, D.C., a sound engineer with a small studio nearby. Without the song being fully formed, without the band, without telling anyone what he was doing, Grohl went in and tracked it. Drums, bass, guitars, vocals. A complete demo. When he played it for Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon later, terrified he'd rip them off, they were enthusiastic. "You're good," they told him. "That's your song." Gil Norton heard the demo when recording resumed. "When I heard Everlong, it was just like, oh," Norton recalled. "It made the album whole. It was the catalyst that brought it all together." But here's what nobody was saying out loud. The Bear Creek recordings were unusable. Most of them anyway. And they were out of budget to re-record in Washington. A decision was made. Start over, in Los Angeles, at a different studio. And here's the part they didn't tell William Goldsmith. Dave Grohl was going to play the drums. February 1997, Dave Grohl, Pat Smear, and Nate Mendel arrive at Grandmaster Recorders in Hollywood, California. William Goldsmith is not with them. He's back in Seattle under the impression that Grohl is just doing some overdubs and final touches in LA, maybe adding some guitar parts, tightening up vocals, normal post-production stuff. Nobody has told him the truth. They're re-recording the entire album. Grandmaster Recorders was a legendary studio, a former silent movie theater that had served as Stevie Wonder's writing and rehearsal space when he was preparing Songs in the Key of Life in 1976. The Black Crowes recorded Shake Your Moneymaker there. Red Hot Chili Peppers recorded One Hot Minute there. The place had serious mojo, and Grohl was about to use that mojo to erase his drummer's contributions. "I had this idea that I was going to play drums because we were running out of time and William was having difficulty recording," Grohl later explained. "I thought, okay, well, just to save time, I'm going to record these new songs and we'll use some of his takes from Bear Creek." Except he didn't use those takes, he re-recorded everything. Song after song after song, Grohl sat behind the drum kit and laid down the tracks himself. Bradley Cook, the engineer at Grandmaster, remembered. The band returned from their Christmas holiday and decided to basically re-record the entire album. They decided to revamp the energy and sound. Week after week passed. Goldsmith, back in Seattle, occasionally checked in. Should he fly down? No, they told him. Just overdubs. We're fine. It was Nate Mendel, Goldsmith's friend from Sunny Day Real Estate, the guy who'd recruited him to Foo Fighters in the first place, who finally told him the truth. Goldsmith was devastated. He'd spent weeks at Bear Creek doing 96 takes of single songs, 13-hour recording sessions where he played until his hands bled, trying to meet Dave Grohl's exacting standards. And now, all of it had been thrown away and replaced without anyone telling him. The versions Dave did were very similar, Goldsmith told the Daily Mail years later. "I am not saying I am an amazing drummer. The work that I did was not bad. I couldn't justify after all the work I put into the record was disregarded." Grohl claims he wanted Goldsmith to stay in the band, just not as the studio drummer. Goldsmith could be their touring drummer, Grohl suggested. They'd use Grohl's recordings on albums, but Goldsmith would play live shows. Goldsmith refused. "I couldn't do it," he said. "The way things were handled, and what was done to me, I think staying in that band would have made me feel like my soul was destroyed, and I would have likely ended up dead." He quit Foo Fighters. On the finished album, The Color and the Shape, William Goldsmith receives drumming credits on exactly 3 songs, Doll, Up in Arms, and My Poor Brain. Everything else is Dave Grohl. In the 2011 documentary Back and Forth, Grohl expressed regret. "I know that William will never forgive me for playing drums on that record. I know it. And I wish things were different. But I felt like this was what I had to do in order to make this album happen. There were a lot of reasons it didn't work out, but there was also a part of me that was like, I don't know if I'm finished playing the drums yet." Goldsmith would later say he wished he'd never met Dave Grohl. He compared him to a schoolyard bully. He said Grohl made him feel creatively raped. But current Foo Fighters drummer Taylor Hawkins, who joined shortly after Goldsmith's departure, defended Grohl in 2018. The first drummer for the Foo Fighters buckled under the pressure and still blames Dave for that. It's like, no dude, and Dave never fired him, by the way. Just so we're all clear, Dave never fired him, he quit. Regardless of who's right, one fact remains. The album that saved Foo Fighters destroyed a friendship. With Goldsmith gone and Grohl behind the drums, The Color and the Shape began to take its final form at Grandmaster Recorders. The album was Grohl's therapy session, and every song reflected a different emotion from his divorce. Dole opened the record with fear and vulnerability, acoustic guitars and whispered vocals about entering situations unprepared. It featured one of Goldsmith's few remaining drum performances. Then came Monkey Wrench, an explosive blast of distorted guitars and screaming vocals. "I'd rather leave than suffer this," Grohl roared. The song was about realizing you're the source of all the problems in a relationship and loving the other person too much to keep hurting them. Grohl said of the song, "It's about realizing that you are the source of all of the problems in a relationship, and you love the other person so much that you just kind of destroy yourself." My Hero was different, an ode to ordinary people rather than celebrity idols, partially inspired by Kurt Cobain. My heroes were ordinary people, Grohl explained, people you can rely on. Walking After You was intimate and tender, a ballad Grohl recorded in Washington, D.C. at WGNS Studios that would later appear on the X-Files soundtrack. The song See You was one only Grohl liked. According to Grohl, the album notes state, only he liked it out of the rest of the band. Enough Space and Up in Arms showcased the band's harder edge, while February Stars offered melancholy reflection, but it all built toward Everlong. Recording Everlong at Grandmaster became an exercise in creative experimentation. Grohl wanted Louise Post from Veruca Salt to sing backup vocals. She was in Chicago, so they recorded her parts over 2 telephone lines, one for her monitor feed, one for recording. The lo-fi quality of her voice coming through the phone line perfectly matched the raw emotion of the song. For the breakdown section, Grohl recorded 3 spoken word tracks. One told a story from assistant engineer Ryan Bosch's childhood about being punished for disturbing his father's sleep. The others were Grohl reading random passages from books. They planned to blend all 3 together, but only Bosch's story made the final mix. The guitar intro was recorded through an Astatic JT40 microphone, a vocal mic that produces deliberately dull recordings with no clarity. Grohl wanted that texture. He wanted the song to sound imperfect, human, raw. Everlong became everything the album was about: beauty in chaos, love in pain, perfection in imperfection. By April 1997, The Color and the Shape was nearly finished, but there were still casualties to come. Pat Smear, the guitarist who'd been with Grohl since Nirvana's final days, was exhausted. At 38, he was a decade older than his bandmates. He'd already spent 20 years playing punk clubs, touring in vans, living on minimal paychecks. Now Foo Fighters was becoming massive, and the grind was relentless. There was also tension. Pat Smear was close friends with Jennifer Youngblood, Grohl's ex-wife. The divorce had put Smear in an impossible position. The daily reality of being in a band with Grohl while knowing what his friend Jennifer was going through was wearing on him. And watching what happened to William Goldsmith, Grohl's ruthless perfectionism, his willingness to replace a bandmate's entire recorded contribution without warning, made Smear question whether he wanted to be part of this anymore. But he kept quiet. For now. The album was finally mixed at Skip Saylor Recorders in Los Angeles and mastered at Gateway Mastering in Portland, Maine. When all was said and done, The Color and the Shape had taken over 4 months to record, a far cry from the 5-day sprint of the debut album. Bassist Nate Mendel summed up the experience in the album's 10th anniversary liner notes. While recording this record, 2 marriages fell apart. We lost a drummer. Someone nearly went to jail. And we discovered late in the day that record making is hellishly expensive and best done with a budget prepared beforehand. May 20th, 1997. The Color and the Shape is released. The music world didn't know about the drama behind The Color and the Shape. They just heard the music, and the music was undeniable. Monkey Wrench was released as the first single in late April 1997. It hit the airwaves like a bomb, aggressive, catchy, perfectly positioned between alternative rock and mainstream radio. It peaked in the top 10 of the alternative songs chart and the mainstream rock chart. When the album dropped on May 20th, it debuted at number 10 on the Billboard 200, higher than the debut album had ever reached. Critics who'd been skeptical suddenly paid attention. Then came Everlong in August 1997. The music video, directed by Michel Gondry, was a surreal satirical parody of The Evil Dead that featured the band members, with Taylor Hawkins, who'd recently joined playing Grohl's wife in drag, in a dream within a dream sequence. The video became an MTV staple. But it was the song itself that cemented Foo Fighters' legacy. Everlong reached number 3 on the alternative songs chart and became the band's signature song, the one they'd close nearly every concert with for the next 25 years. David Letterman called it his favorite song. When he returned to Late Show after heart surgery in 2000, Foo Fighters performed Everlong for him. Here they are, ladies and gentlemen, my favorite band playing my favorite song, Foo Fighters, Letterman announced. Rolling Stone would eventually rank Everlong number 409 on their list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. The song would be performed over 1,095 times in concert, more than any other Foo Fighters song. My Hero followed as the third single in 1998, again reaching the top 10. The album was nominated for Best Rock Album at the 40th Annual Grammy Awards, though it lost to John Fogerty's Blue Moon Swamp. By year's end, The Color and the Shape had sold over 2 million copies, making it the biggest-selling album in Foo Fighters history. But on September 4, 1997, at the MTV Video Music Awards, something unexpected happened. The band performed Monkey Wrench on the marquee outside Radio City Music Hall as part of the VMA pregame show. When they came back to perform a second song, Pat Smear took the microphone. "The last song we played was my last song with the band," Smear said casually. "I would like to introduce you to Franz Stahl, who will be taking over." And just like that, live on MTV, Pat Smear quit Foo Fighters. He handed his guitar to Franz Stahl, Grohl's former bandmate from Scream, and walked off as the band launched into Everlong. Smear later explained he left mainly due to exhaustion from the band's relentless touring schedule. But those close to the situation knew there was more to it. The tension from Grohl's divorce, the treatment of William Goldsmith, the feeling that Foo Fighters had become something other than the fun project they'd started 3 years earlier. In the press, Grohl kept it diplomatic. William decided he didn't want to go on tour and he wanted to play with different people. "There's no serious animosity, but it sucks. But losing both your drummer and guitarist within months of releasing your biggest album? That's not a good look." March 1997. Before Pat Smear's departure, before William Goldsmith even officially quit, Dave Grohl was already thinking about the future. He needed a drummer, but who could fill that role in a band led by one of the greatest drummers in rock history? Grohl thought of Taylor Hawkins, Alanis Morissette's touring drummer. The two had met backstage at festivals throughout 1996 and 1997, and their chemistry was instant. Even Morissette had joked to Hawkins, "What are you going to do when Dave asks you to be his drummer?" Grohl assumed Hawkins would never leave Morissette. At the time, she was one of the biggest acts in the world, touring Jagged Little Pill in sold-out arenas globally. Foo Fighters, by contrast, were still playing clubs and theaters. So when Grohl called Hawkins, ostensibly to ask for drummer recommendations, he was shocked by Hawkins' response. "Do you have any good recommendations?" Grohl asked. "How about me, you asshole?" Hawkins replied. Hawkins explained later. "It wasn't that I was ever unhappy playing with Alanis. She's very talented. But when you're working for somebody, it's a completely different atmosphere to being in a band. With Alanis, I had to watch what I did and said, with the Foo Fighters, I'm my own boss, and it feels good to be part of a family." The band announced Hawkins as their new drummer on March 18, 1997. Though he joined after The Color and the Shape was recorded, Hawkins appeared in the Monkey Wrench music video and famously played drums in drag as Grohl's wife in the Everlong video. "Upon first meeting, our bond was immediate," Grohl wrote in his 2021 memoir, The Storyteller. "I am not afraid to say that our chance meeting was a kind of love at first sight, igniting a musical twin flame that still burns to this day." Hawkins would remain Foo Fighters' drummer for 25 years until his tragic death in March 2022 at age 50. The last song he ever performed live with the band was Everlong. The Color and the Shape became the template for everything Foo Fighters would do afterward. The album proved that Dave Grohl could lead a band, write anthems, and step out of Nirvana's shadow. It showed that post-grunge could be melodic, emotional, and commercially successful without sacrificing authenticity. The 3 singles, Monkey Wrench, Everlong, and My Hero, became rock radio staples that still receive regular airplay today, nearly 30 years later. The album remains the band's best-selling record in the United States, with over 2 million copies sold. Critically, the album has aged remarkably well. While some reviewers at the time complained that Gil Norton had polished away the punk edges, later assessments recognized The Color and the Shape as a defining post-grunge masterpiece. In 2020, Metal Hammer included it in their list of the top 10 albums of 1997. The album influenced countless bands that followed. Its combination of heavy riffs, melodic hooks, emotional vulnerability, and arena-sized production became the blueprint for mainstream alternative rock in the late 90s and early 2000s. Pat Smear would return to Foo Fighters in 2005, initially as a touring guitarist, before rejoining as a full member in 2010. He appears on every Foo Fighters album since Wasting Light, 2011. William Goldsmith never reconciled with Grohl. He rejoined Sunny Day Real Estate, later played with The Fire Theft, and eventually formed the band Assertion. In a 2017 Daily Mail interview, he said, "I wish I'd never met Dave Grohl. That feeling might change if we actually sat down and talked. But that hasn't happened yet." Gil Norton reflected on the album's creation. "When you're a producer, the aim of the game is to extract the best performances, the best songs, and the best album at the end of the day. Pre-production always has been, will be, and shall forevermore be the most important part of production." But perhaps Dave Grohl himself said it best when describing the album years later. "We've made a record I consider such a move forward for the band. For the rest of my life, when I listen to this record, it will be the fall of 1996 and my journal entries.